At the will reading in our sun-drenched Coral Gables estate, my Uncle Gary, the man who took me in as a favor after my parents died, stood at the head of the mahogany table and proudly declared, "All 6 Miami Beach condos go to my son. She gets nothing." The room exploded. Expensive crystal clinked, and 30 relatives cheered, like Jackson had just won the Super Bowl. My older brother stood there, soaking up the applause like it was sunlight, while his fiancée, Brooke, whispered that he deserved this. I did not clap. I did not flinch. I just looked at the family lawyer, Mr. Hollis, and asked, "You really do not know, do you?" Gary's face turned ghostly as he screamed, "No." "What?" Welcome to Stories. Sitting here, with my coffee, watching the world go by, I'm reminded how quickly life shifts from calm to a storm. Where are you watching from today, and what is your favorite drink? I always look forward to your comments. But in that room, the peace was already gone. The silence that followed Gary's scream was heavier than the Miami humidity pressing against the French doors. Mr. Hollis adjusted his bifocals, looking between us like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But Gary did not wait for an answer. He was a man who lived by the rule that volume equals authority, and when he did not get his way, he simply shifted the battlefield. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished mahogany until it stopped right in front of me. It was a maintenance invoice for $15,000. Gary cleared his throat, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain his footing. "Since you are the forensic accountant and you are doing so well for yourself," he said, his voice regaining its practiced, condescending edge, "we have decided you will handle the emergency maintenance assessment fees for the South Beach units. It needs to be paid by tomorrow morning to keep the properties in good standing. Consider it your final contribution to the family honor as Jackson takes over." My Aunt Patricia reached out and patted my hand, her eyes watery and rehearsed. "It is only fair, Jordan," she whispered. "You have the stable income. We have all sacrificed so much. We have all sacrificed so much to keep the Whitaker name respected." I looked at the invoice, then at my mother's manicured hand. I realized then that my relationship with them had never been a bond of blood. It had been a subscription service, and I was the only one footing the bill. This was the trap they had been setting for decades, the normalization of cruelty. They did not see themselves as exploitative. They saw my hard work as a collective family asset they were entitled to harvest whenever they pleased. In their twisted logic, my reliability was just a tool they could use to fix Jackson's failures, and they framed their greed as a practical family decision. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and they were shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. I did not cry. I did not ask why Jackson, with his brand new inheritance, could not pay his own bills. I did not remind them that I had already worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years to save Gary's business from his own reckless bookkeeping. I simply stood up, the chair legs scraping against the marble floor, with a sound like a closing gavel. I left the pen untouched. I left the $15,000 bill sitting on the table, a white flag of surrender they actually expected me to sign. I did not say goodbye. I walked through the foyer, past the coordinated family portraits and the suffocating smell of lilies, and stepped out into the humid Miami air. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already vibrating in my pocket. It was a text from Jackson. "You bitter loser," it read. "You were always just the help around here. Dad is furious. You better resend that money or you are dead to this family." I did not answer. I did not even feel the sting of his words. I just looked at the screen and felt a strange, cold clarity. This was not a family crisis. It was a liquidation. I put the car in gear and drove away from the Gables, leaving their version of honor in the rearview mirror. Inside me, the anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. And it was finally time to start the real accounting. The office door clicked shut, sealing out the thick, humid air of downtown Miami. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I let the soft, cold glow of my computer monitor illuminate the space. This was my sanctuary, a 12 by 12-foot box of reality that I had built myself, far from the polished lies of the Coral Gables estate. The room smelled like industrial carpet and the lingering scent of high-grade toner. There were no family photos here. No portraits of Jackson holding a trophy or Gary looking smug at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. There was only a whiteboard covered in flowcharts and a filing cabinet that held the truth. I sat down, the ergonomic chair supporting a spine that had been bent under the weight of my family's expectations for 32 years. I pulled the first encrypted folder onto my desktop. I had been preparing for this moment for exactly 3 years, ever since the night Gary called me to fix his books. Back then, the anger was not loud. It was a low-frequency hum, a constant vibration in my bones that I had learned to ignore. I had realized that I was trapped in a prison without bars, a psychological cage where my own reliability was the lock. I was the stable one, the smart one, the one who would be fine on her own. But those labels were not compliments. They were the invisible chains of a survivor. Gary and Jackson had perfected the art of normalizing their cruelty. They did not see their exploitation of my skills as a betrayal. They saw it as a family duty that I owed them for the privilege of being a Whitaker. They had convinced my mother that my unpaid labor was a practical family decision to keep the business afloat, while they funneled every spare dollar toward Jackson. I remember the nights I spent in Gary's dusty home office, drinking lukewarm tea Patricia left on the doorframe like I was a stray cat. I found hundreds of thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses that were actually Jackson's bar tabs and golf memberships. When I pointed them out, Gary told me to stop being dramatic. He said I was the reliable one, so I should just make the numbers work. He framed their greed as my responsibility, a narrative I had allowed to persist while I gathered the evidence to destroy it. My silence during those years was not a sign of weakness. It was a survival strategy. I was a survivor, not a victim, and every hour of unpaid labor I gave him was a link I was adding to my own chain of evidence. People see a girl staying quiet and think she is broken, but I was just an architect building a case. I was the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their delusions, while I mapped out the exit. I realized then that their love was a contract they had breached long ago, a subscription I was finally ready to cancel. The most insulting part was the day after I saved Gary's business from a federal tax lien. I had asked him for a small loan, $5,000, to help with the startup costs for my own forensic accounting firm. I had a business plan, a client list, and a 5-year projection. Gary laughed. He literally laughed in my face over his morning espresso. He told me to be realistic, that I should just stay on as his assistant because I was so useful there. The very next afternoon, a flatbed truck delivered a vintage Porsche to the driveway. Gary had paid $24,000 in cash for it, a graduation gift for a son who had barely scraped through his second attempt at a business degree. I sat back in my office chair now and pulled up the encrypted file Great Aunt Teresa had helped me start. Teresa was the only one who did not buy Gary's self-made man narrative. She had always told me that my birth parents, the ones who died when I was 5, had been the real workers in the family. Before she passed, she gave me a box of old banking records from the early 90s. She had whispered that paper beats promises every single time. She was the only one who saw the truth of things, and she trusted me to carry it forward. I began the audit, my fingers moving across the keys with lethal precision. I was not just looking for missing maintenance fees anymore. I was looking for the ghost of a $1,200,000 payout. I was digging into the purchase history of the 6 Gables condos that Jackson thought he had just inherited. I knew the truth was hidden under layers of shell companies and offshore transfers. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and I was going to make sure every cent was accounted for. I rubbed my eyes, but there was no fatigue, only the cold, clinical clarity of a professional about to dismantle a lifelong lie. Inside my office, the fluorescent lights hummed a different tune now. the sound of an impending avalanche. I was not just Jordan the daughter anymore. I was the auditor of their souls, and I was about to find every single cent they had stolen from my legacy. The cold blue light of my smartphone screen flickered in the darkness of my office. It was exactly 11:51 p.m. when the first notification chimed, a digital herald of the storm Gary had finally unleashed. I did not reach for it. I did not need to. I already knew the frequency of his desperation. Within seconds, the screen was a scrolling ledger of malice. Gary had taken the war to the one place he felt most powerful, the public arena of social media. His Facebook post was a masterpiece of manufactured heartbreak. He had uploaded a photo from 10 years ago, a forced family portrait where I was standing slightly out of focus in the back while he beamed over Jackson's shoulder. The caption read, "When your own child betrays the family name and refuses to honor her responsibilities, you realize some people only care about themselves. I gave Jordan everything, and this is how she repays us." Praying for guidance. It was clinical in its manipulation, a strategic move to leverage our social circle against me. I did not flinch. I did not feel the sting of the comments piling up, aunts and family friends offering thoughts and prayers while labeling me a monster. Instead, I opened my laptop and began a different kind of logging. Every heart on that post from my relatives was a data point. I was recording the liquidation of their moral authority. Jackson, of course, could not help himself. He had commented under Gary's post, "She was always just the help in the family business, Dad." Guess she finally showed her true colors when the money was not easy anymore. I watched as Patricia hearted Jackson's comment. It was a silent confirmation of the hierarchy they had lived by for 32 years. They were not shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I rubbed my eyes, not to summon regret, but to clear my vision for the spreadsheets. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now their account was officially frozen. The smear campaign continued through the night. More messages poured in, accusations of being ungrateful, selfish, and cold. I did not answer a single one. I went back to my spreadsheet. Each toxic word they typed was a green light, a moral authorization for the systematic audit I was about to complete. They thought they were destroying my reputation, but they were actually providing the perfect distraction while I finished the professional audit that would destroy their throne. Inside my office, the air was still and smelled of cold coffee and ozone. While they were busy performing for a non-existent audience, I was busy perfecting the accounting of their betrayal. I was the invisible ATM for a family that didn't even like me. Now, I realized it had been a subscription, and I was finally clicking cancel. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. Every screenshot I saved, every lie I documented, was a line of code in the software of their downfall. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Gary's post had been shared 40 times. I smiled at the screen, a soft, dangerous expression. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted a narrative. Fine. I would give them exactly what they asked for, but the ending would not be written in a Facebook post. It would be written in a court of law. I waited until the digital echoes of Gary's tantrum began to fade before I made the call that would end their world. I did not call my mother to plead for understanding. I did not call Jackson to defend myself against his labels. I called Marcus, a specialist real estate litigator whose reputation in Miami was built on dismantling fraudulent empires. He had been a colleague of mine during my time as a junior analyst, and he knew that when I brought him a file, it was not a guess, it was a conviction. The next morning, the air in Marcus's office was crisp, smelling of expensive leather and the cold logic of law. He sat across from me, a leather portfolio open on his desk, his sharp eyes scanning the initial results of my audit. "This is quite a situation, Jordan," he said, tapping a finger on a wire transfer from 1998. "If these numbers mean what I think they mean, your father did not just overlook you. He systematically erased your future before it even started." We dove into the purchase history of the Gables condos. Gary had always told the family he bought the first 2 units in South Beach using the profits from his construction firm. It was the foundation of his self-made myth, a story he had used to justify Jackson's easy life and my constant labor. But as we traced the capital, the narrative did not hold. The construction company had been in the red during the late 90s. The $300,000 used for the down payment did not come from business revenue. It came from a ghost account. We tracked the funds back to a life insurance payout following my biological parents' car accident when I was 5. The payout had been $1,200,000, intended for a trust that was supposed to be mine. Gary, acting as my legal guardian, had established himself as the trustee, but instead of preserving the legacy of my birth parents, he had used my blood money to buy his way into the Miami real estate market. I sat there, watching the digital trail materialize on Marcus's screen. My birth parents had died to ensure I was cared for, and Gary had turned their tragedy into his private bank account. He had used the interest from my stolen trust to pay for Jackson's private schools and European summers, while I was wearing hand-me-downs and saving pennies for a math tutor. He had stolen my identity and my legacy to build a throne for a son who could barely read a balance sheet. He purchased all 6 units this way, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. He shuffled the funds through 4 different shell companies to mask the origin, but the signature on the initial transfer is where he slipped up. He pulled up a scanned document, a power of attorney, dated 15 years ago. It bore my name, but the handwriting was a clumsy mimicry of mine. He had forged my signature to grant himself total control over the trust funds the moment I turned 18. He had used my social security number to set up these shell companies while I was still a minor, then kept my credit file frozen for years under the pretense of protecting me from identity theft. I was a forensic auditor who had been locked out of my own financial life by the very man I trusted. I looked at the forgery and felt a sudden, freezing clarity. This was not a family disagreement. It was a crime scene. Gary had not just been a bad father. He was a thief who had been living on my overdraft for 3 decades. My quietness for all those years had not been a sign of weakness. It was the invisible chains of a survivor, a tactical silence while I gathered the evidence to unlock the cell. You all lived in a house of cards, and you forgot who paid for the foundation. The silent investor is withdrawing her capital. Marcus looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I did not cry. I did not ask why he did it. I simply looked at the $1,200,000 figure on the screen and said, "This is not revenge, Marcus. It is accounting." Inside the office, the sun continued to hit the glass buildings of downtown Miami, but for the Whitakers, the lights were about to go out. We were no longer talking about maintenance fees or ungrateful daughters. We were talking about identity theft, forgery, and a decade of fraud. I was the architect of their downfall, and I was about to deliver the final invoice. The living room at the Gables was exactly as I had left it, except the crab cakes were cold and the celebration had turned into a vigil of arrogance. 30 people were still there, sipping what remained of the champagne, waiting for the sensible daughter to come back and sign her own financial death warrant. Jackson was leaning against the fireplace, whispering something to Brooke that made her laugh, a sharp, expensive sound that he thought he had bought with my future. Gary was at the head of the table, his face flushed with the kind of victory that only a thief can enjoy. Then the front door opened. I did not knock. I did not ask for permission. I walked in, wheeling the same black suitcase that Gary assumed was filled with my clothes, for an exit. The room went quiet, the kind of silence that usually precedes a hurricane. Gary stood up, his eyes narrow and full of the lecture he had been rehearsing. "Back to be reasonable, Jordan?" he asked, his voice booming for the benefit of the witnesses. "We have already decided. The condos are Jackson's. Sign the maintenance assessment, and maybe we can discuss an apology for that Facebook mess you caused." I did not answer. I positioned the suitcase in the center of the mahogany table, right over the $15,000 invoice Gary had tried to force on me. I flicked the metal latches. Click, click. The sound cut through the room like a blade. I opened the lid and pulled out the first document, the certified purchase record for the South Beach units. You told the family you built this empire on hard work, Gary, I said, my voice steady and clinical. But these records say something else. I laid out the audit trail. $1,200,000, the payout from my biological parents' life insurance. I placed the forged power of attorney right on top, the one where his clumsy mimicry of my 18-year-old's signature was highlighted in neon yellow. The room did not just go quiet. It became a vacuum. Mr. Hollis, the lawyer, stepped forward, his hand trembling as he picked up the forgery. He looked at Gary, then at the document, and I saw the moment his world collapsed. These units were never yours to give, I said, looking Gary in the eye. They were bought with my blood money. I have already filed a lis pendens on every single unit, freezing your ability to sell or move a dime. Gary, you can sign these quitclaim deeds right now to settle your debt to me, or my attorney hits send on a digital criminal referral to the state attorney's office. The evidence of forgery is undeniable. You have 60 seconds to decide, the property or a federal indictment. The power flip was absolute. Gary staggered back, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the stolen wine in his glass. Jackson lunged for the papers, shouting that it was a mistake, that I was lying, but Mr. Hollis held up a hand. Legally, Gary, if these forensic documents are authentic, this entire estate plan is void, and you are facing serious federal liability. I cannot and will not execute this distribution. We need to freeze all assets immediately, pending a full investigation. Brooke looked at Jackson, her hand dropping from his arm as if he had suddenly become contagious. She walked out of the room without a word, leaving her champagne to spill on the Persian rug. Jackson's financial house of cards collapsed before the sun set. Without the condos to prop up his delusions, his creditors moved in like vultures. Gary and Patricia were forced to sell the Gables estate to pay back the $1,200,000 plus 3 decades of interest. They moved into a 2-bedroom condo overlooking a parking lot, a place where the air did not smell like lilies, but like the consequences they had tried to avoid. But I did not live in those condos. I did not need their luxury. I converted the income from the South Beach units into the Teresa Foundation. We focus on helping children who have suffered financial identity theft at the hands of their own guardians. It was not about revenge. It was about ensuring Gary finally reaped exactly what he had sown. It was poetic justice, decades in the making. I turned Gary's legacy of greed into a legacy of construction. Every ledger I balance now helps another child find the ground beneath their feet. I have come to realize that your worth is not a number that someone else gets to decide. I spent 30 years thinking I was a burden because that was the story Gary needed to tell to keep his hands in my pockets. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember this. The people who treat you like an afterthought are usually the ones most terrified of your clarity. Being overlooked is not a weakness. It is a tactical advantage. It gives you the freedom to build your own fortress while they are too busy performing for a crowd that does not exist. Paper beats promises every single time, but character is the only thing that cannot be stolen. If you have ever had to choose between the family you were born into and the peace you built yourself, drop a yes in the comments and tell me where you are listening from. Your story matters. Like and follow for more stories of justice. Stay strong, stay steady, and take care of yourself first.